There are mysteries that leave you unsettled, and then there are cases so strange, so utterly baffling, that even the sharpest investigators walk away shaking their heads. This is one of those cases. Imagine a puzzle where every piece you try to fit only creates another gap, a story that teeters between reality and the surreal. Eyewitness accounts clash. Evidence points everywhere, yet somehow nowhere. And the deeper you dig, the less sense it makes. What happened here? Was it a crime? An accident? Or something far beyond human explanation? Tonight, we're diving into a case that has haunted experts, terrified locals, and kept armchair detectives awake for decades. Chapter 1. The Vanishing. It began like any ordinary day, or so it seemed. In a quiet neighborhood, where everyone knew each other by name, one person simply disappeared. No struggle, no fight, nothing to indicate a sudden danger. One moment, they were there talking to neighbors, grabbing coffee, or walking their dog. The next, they were gone, leaving only questions behind. Neighbors reported odd, fleeting moments, a car parked too long near the house, unfamiliar footsteps late at night, and a mailbox that hadn't been emptied for days. At first, authorities treated it as a standard missing person case. But soon, inconsistencies began to surface. Witness statements didn't match. The timeline seemed off. And some clues didn't make sense at all, like they were pieces of a puzzle no one had the picture for. The community felt the weight of disbelief. How could someone vanish without a trace in a place where everyone watched out for one another? It was as if reality had been bent, just slightly, but enough to leave a chilling void. Even seasoned detectives found themselves staring at reports, shaking their heads, and asking a simple question. Where did they go? Chapter 2. Red Herrings. As the investigation unfolded, one frustrating reality became clear. Not everything was as it seemed. Leads appeared promising, only to dissolve into confusion. A neighbor's sighting placed the missing person miles away from their last known location, but when authorities investigated, it was a dead end. A mysterious note hinted at danger, but handwriting analysis revealed it came from someone with no connection at all. These red herrings weren't just mistakes. They were distractions that pulled the investigation in circles. Detectives found themselves chasing shadows, each false lead consuming precious time and energy. And the more they dug, the more contradictions emerged. It was like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle, only to find that half the pieces belonged to an entirely different picture. The community, meanwhile, grew restless. Everyone had an opinion, and every rumor felt urgent, credible even, until it wasn't. Social media buzzed with speculation, strange vehicles, odd phone calls, unexplained movements. Each new tip seemed like it could crack the case wide open, but more often than not, it ended up sending investigators down yet another blind alley. Chapter 3. A Stranger's Clues. Just when the investigation seemed to be spiraling into confusion, a new thread appeared, one that no one saw coming. Evidence began surfacing that pointed not to someone familiar, but to a complete stranger. Small, almost inconsequential items at first, a torn piece of paper, an unfamiliar shoe print, seemed almost accidental. Yet, each one carried a silent message. Someone had been there, someone had observed, and someone knew more than they were saying. Detectives were puzzled. The clues didn't match any known suspects or previous sightings. It was as if an outsider had stepped into this ordinary life and left cryptic breadcrumbs, daring investigators to follow. Who was this stranger, and why were they leaving hints rather than answers? Was it an attempt to help, or a sinister game designed to confuse? The more these peculiar traces appeared, the more it became clear that this case wasn't just about the missing person anymore. It had become a puzzle with hidden hands at play, each clue hinting at stories that went unseen, motives that remained locked in shadows. Chapter 4. Conflicting Testimonies. As the investigation deepened, a new challenge emerged: the human factor. Witnesses who had once seemed reliable began giving conflicting statements. Neighbors recalled seeing the missing person at different times, sometimes even places that contradicted other accounts. Friends described conversations that never happened, or, at least, not the way they remembered. This wasn't just minor confusion. It was a tangle of contradictions that threatened to derail the case entirely. Investigators quickly realized that memory isn't always a faithful recorder of events. Stress, fear, and even subconscious bias could warp what people thought they saw or heard. And in this case, every small discrepancy felt like a clue and a trap at the same time. The tension grew. Detectives started asking themselves, who could be trusted? Could anyone's account be taken at face value? And were some of these conflicting testimonies deliberate attempts to mislead, rather than innocent mistakes? Chapter 5: The Unseen Threat. As the investigation unfolded, a new, unsettling realization took hold. Something, or someone, loomed just out of sight. There were signs, subtle and almost imperceptible, that danger might be closer than anyone imagined. Strange phone calls with silence on the other end. Shadows glimpsed through half-closed blinds. Doors found slightly ajar when no one had entered. At first, these signs seemed trivial, almost paranoid. But the pattern grew harder to ignore. Investigators and family members alike felt it, a creeping sense that the case was no longer just a matter of facts, timelines, or evidence. It had taken on a life of its own. Someone, or something, was influencing events from the shadows, leaving whispers of unease in every corner. The idea of an unseen threat added an extra layer of tension. It wasn't just about locating a missing person anymore. It was about navigating an invisible maze, where every step carried risk and every clue might be a trap. Chapter 6: Hidden Motives. As the investigation progressed, a new layer emerged: motives. But these weren't obvious or straightforward. Beneath the surface of everyday interactions lay secrets, grudges, and desires that no one expected. Friends who seemed loyal, colleagues who appeared indifferent, even family members who appeared supportive, all had aspects of their lives that could be seen in a different light when examined closely. Detectives began to dig deeper, exploring relationships and past events that might explain why someone would want to manipulate, mislead, or harm. What initially seemed like coincidences started to form subtle patterns. Arguments long forgotten, hidden financial dealings, whispered threats, tiny threads that, when woven together, painted a picture of possible motives lurking just beneath the surface. The chilling realization set in. Appearances could no longer be trusted. People who smiled, nodded, and offered help might also hold the key to understanding the case, or concealing the truth entirely. Chapter 7: Anomalous Evidence. Just when investigators thought they were beginning to grasp the threads of the case, the evidence itself turned strange. Items surfaced that didn't belong, objects that defied logical explanation. A jacket 2 sizes too small left at the scene. A set of fingerprints that matched no one in the database. A phone call traced to a number that technically didn't exist. Each piece felt like a contradiction. How could evidence point to something real and yet impossible at the same time? Detectives ran tests, repeated analyses, and consulted specialists, but every answer led to more questions. It was as though the case itself resisted resolution, taunting those who dared to untangle it. For the families, these anomalies were torture. Were they proof of foul play, or were they missteps in the investigation? For the investigators, they were a haunting reminder that sometimes, even facts can feel deceptive. Chapter 8: The Investigation Deepens. By this stage, the case had evolved from a local mystery into a full-scale investigation. What began with routine questioning and neighborhood searches now expanded into specialized task forces, forensic experts, and long nights spent combing through every scrap of information. Detectives knew that if they didn't dig deeper, the truth would remain forever buried. They revisited old evidence with fresh eyes, running tests that had been unavailable just years earlier. DNA swabs were taken from items once thought irrelevant. Digital forensics specialists sifted through hard drives, tracing deleted files and hidden communications. Even the smallest detail, a timestamp, a smudge of dirt, a missed phone call, was re-examined in hopes it would unlock the next piece of the puzzle. With each step forward, however, came new challenges. For every promising lead, another fell apart. For every piece of clarity, another contradiction arose. Yet the deeper they went, the more it became clear. This was no ordinary disappearance. Chapter 9. Media Frenzy. When the story first broke, it was a local headline. But as the details grew stranger, the case exploded onto the national stage. Reporters camped outside police stations. Satellite trucks crowded quiet neighborhoods. Microphones and cameras seemed to appear overnight, eager to capture any scrap of new information. For investigators, the sudden spotlight was a double-edged sword. On one hand, widespread attention brought in tips, leads, and public awareness. On the other, it created noise, so much noise, that sorting fact from fiction became nearly impossible. Rumors spread faster than confirmed updates. Social media fueled wild speculation, with armchair detectives offering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Families found themselves thrust into the glare, their grief broadcast to millions. Some welcomed the coverage, hoping that the right person might see their plea and come forward. Others felt overwhelmed, their private pain transformed into a public spectacle. Chapter 10. Suspicions Arise. With the media amplifying every theory and the investigation digging deeper, suspicion began to shift from the unknown stranger to those much closer to home. Friends, co-workers, even family members found themselves under scrutiny. Every alibi was tested, every detail of their lives dissected. It's a harsh reality of cases like this. The circle closest to the missing person often becomes the first pool of suspects. Detectives couldn't ignore inconsistencies in statements, sudden changes in behavior, or hidden tensions that had previously gone unnoticed. A smile that once seemed genuine now looked rehearsed. A word of comfort could just as easily mask guilt. The atmosphere grew tense. Relationships strained as trust eroded. Those once united in grief began to eye each other with doubt. Investigators had to ask themselves, were they looking at a community desperate for answers, or a circle of people with secrets worth hiding? Chapter 11. False Confessions. Just when investigators thought they were narrowing in on answers, the case took another bizarre turn. Confessions began pouring in. Not one, not two, but several individuals stepped forward claiming responsibility for the disappearance. At first, it seemed like a breakthrough. Could the truth really have been hiding in plain sight all along? But as each confession was examined, the excitement quickly turned to disbelief. The stories didn't line up. Timelines clashed with hard evidence. Some details were so far from reality that detectives couldn't help but wonder why anyone would come forward at all. False confessions are more common than people think, especially in high-profile cases. Some are driven by a craving for attention, others by guilt over unrelated actions, and sometimes by sheer delusion. In this case, the flood of misleading admissions added yet another layer of chaos to an already tangled investigation. Chapter 12. A Breakthrough. After weeks of confusion, dead ends, and frustration, the case reached a turning point. It began with a single overlooked detail, a piece of evidence that had been sitting quietly in the background, dismissed as unimportant. But when a fresh set of eyes revisited it, everything changed. The discovery didn't solve the case outright, but it cracked open a door investigators thought was permanently sealed. Suddenly, timelines began to align. Witness testimonies that once seemed contradictory now took on new meaning. It was as if the investigation had been stuck in darkness, and this single clue flicked on a dim but undeniable light. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly among the team, breathing new energy into exhausted detectives. For the first time in months, there was momentum, real momentum, and it pointed toward a direction no one had fully considered before. Chapter 13. Expert Analysis. With the breakthrough in hand, investigators knew they needed outside perspective. Specialists from multiple fields were brought in: criminal profilers, forensic scientists, digital analysts, even behavioral psychologists. Each was tasked with examining the evidence not just for what it showed, but for what it implied. The profilers' insights were chilling. Based on patterns of behavior, they suggested the case wasn't random at all. It bore the hallmarks of planning, careful, deliberate steps taken by someone who understood how to stay one step ahead. Meanwhile, Forensic experts dissected the anomalous evidence, pointing out details most would have missed. Microscopic fibers, chemical traces, and patterns in digital metadata that hinted at deliberate tampering. But perhaps the most unsettling input came from the psychologists. They argued that much of the confusion, false confessions, conflicting testimonies, and misleading evidence could be symptoms of manipulation. Someone, they suggested, might be orchestrating chaos as a way to stay hidden in plain sight.
Chapter 14. The Psychology of Deception. If there was one thread running through this baffling case, it was deception. Lies layered over half-truths, confessions twisted into distractions, evidence manipulated just enough to keep investigators doubting themselves. To understand the case, detectives had to step into the mind of someone who thrived on misdirection. Psychologists explained that deception isn't always about telling outright lies. More often, it's about controlling perception, deciding what others notice, and what they overlook. A misplaced item, a suspicious story, a perfectly timed rumor. Each could steer an investigation away from the truth without ever requiring a blatant falsehood. And the person behind this case seemed to understand that deeply. They weren't just hiding, they were crafting a narrative. Each misleading clue wasn't random. It was intentional, designed to draw attention in one direction while the real answers lay hidden in another. Chapter 15. Uncovering Connections. With deception at the center of the case, detectives began to look for links that had previously gone unnoticed. They started connecting names, events, and locations, mapping them out like constellations. At first, the connections seemed random, but slowly a pattern began to emerge. An old coworker who hadn't seen the missing person in years was suddenly mentioned by multiple witnesses. A seemingly irrelevant location, a diner off a highway, kept reappearing in testimonies. Financial records revealed small, odd transactions that tied people together in ways no one expected. Each discovery hinted at a larger web, one that stretched beyond the immediate circle of family and friends. The more detectives traced these threads, the clearer it became. This wasn't an isolated incident. The disappearance was tangled in a wider network of relationships, hidden dealings, and unspoken histories that reached further than anyone had guessed. Chapter 16. The Dark History. Every small town, every close-knit community, carries shadows in its past. And in this case, digging into history revealed those shadows were darker than anyone imagined. Old police reports, long-buried rumors, and forgotten scandals painted a picture of a place where unsettling events weren't new. They were just hidden. Years before the disappearance, there had been unexplained incidents. Fires that started without clear causes, violent disputes that mysteriously fizzled out before reaching trial, and a handful of vanishings that never got the attention they deserved. Each seemed isolated, until investigators placed them side by side. Suddenly, a pattern emerged, one echoing the same kind of confusion and manipulation they were facing now. It was as if the disappearance wasn't an isolated mystery at all, but part of a recurring cycle, a history that had been carefully covered over, resurfacing now in a way too familiar to ignore. Chapter 17. A Town in Fear. As the investigation dragged on, and whispers of the town's hidden past began to surface, fear spread quickly. Streets that were once lively grew quieter after dark. Neighbors who used to greet each other with warmth now avoided eye contact, wary of who might be connected to the case. Local businesses reported a dip in customers, especially at night. Parents kept their children indoors. Even longtime residents admitted they no longer felt safe walking alone. The disappearance had shaken the town to its core, but the hints of deeper, older secrets pushed that fear into paranoia. Rumors filled the silence. Some swore the town was cursed. Others whispered about powerful people pulling strings behind the scenes. Fear wasn't just a response anymore. It was shaping how the community lived, breathed, and spoke. And investigators knew this collective anxiety could either lead to valuable tips or bury the truth even deeper. Chapter 18. Dead Ends. For every promising lead that lit up the investigation, there seemed to be two more that fizzled into nothing. Detectives chased down tips that sounded convincing, only to discover they were based on hearsay or flat-out fabrication. A supposed eyewitness claimed to have seen the missing person days after the disappearance, but surveillance footage proved they couldn't have been in that location at all. Digital trails that once looked like breakthroughs collapsed under scrutiny, revealed as glitches, coincidences, or deliberate attempts to mislead. Even DNA samples, the gold standard of modern investigations, came back inconclusive or unrelated. Each dead end chipped away at morale, leaving investigators exhausted and second-guessing their own instincts. It wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. With every wrong turn, the real trail grew colder. And the lingering question haunted the team. Were these dead ends simply the product of chance, or part of a carefully constructed maze meant to keep them lost? Chapter 19. The Turning Tide. Just when it seemed the investigation was destined to collapse under the weight of endless dead ends, something shifted. A new piece of information surfaced, not dramatic at first glance but different. Unlike so many of the misleading clues, this one held up under scrutiny. It came from an unexpected source, a quiet resident who had avoided the media frenzy and never once called in a tip. They hadn't stepped forward earlier because they assumed what they noticed was trivial. But when investigators listened closely, it added a missing piece to the timeline, one that directly contradicted earlier assumptions. The effect was immediate. With this new puzzle piece, old evidence snapped into alignment in ways detectives hadn't seen before. Patterns long dismissed as coincidence suddenly made sense. It wasn't the full picture, but it was the first real sign that the tide might finally be turning in their favor. Chapter 20. Confronting Suspicions. With the tide finally turning, investigators began to act on suspicions they had long kept quiet. Certain names had hovered on the edges of the case. Individuals who never fit neatly into alibis, whose stories shifted ever so slightly with each retelling. Until now, there had never been enough to confront them directly. That changed. Armed with the new evidence, detectives started knocking on doors, asking sharper questions, no longer content with vague answers. The tone of the investigation shifted from cautious inquiry to pointed confrontation. Some suspects grew defensive, others angry, and a few, perhaps the most telling, remained eerily calm, as though they had expected this moment all along. Each interview revealed cracks, inconsistencies in timelines, odd gaps in memory, subtle slips in language that hinted at knowledge no innocent person should have. For the first time, investigators felt they weren't just chasing shadows. They were pressing against the walls of the truth. Chapter 21. A shocking revelation. The case had been strange from the beginning, but nothing prepared investigators for the revelation that now surfaced. It started with a re-examination of a piece of evidence most had written off months earlier. An object so ordinary it had been catalogued, filed, and nearly forgotten. Under closer analysis, however, it revealed something staggering. A hidden connection tying the missing person directly to someone long considered outside the scope of suspicion. It wasn't a vague link, either. It was undeniable, tangible, and impossible to dismiss. The discovery hit the team like a lightning bolt. Everything they thought they knew about the disappearance suddenly tilted. Theories collapsed, and new ones emerged in their place. And with this revelation came an unsettling question. If this connection had been hiding in plain sight all along, what else had they overlooked? Chapter 22. Piecing it together. Armed with the shocking revelation, investigators returned to the mountain of evidence that once felt chaotic and unmanageable. But this time they looked at it differently. With the hidden connection in mind, fragments that never quite fit suddenly locked into place like parts of a puzzle that had been upside down. Timelines straightened out. Alibis that once seemed airtight now looked shaky. The misleading confessions, the false tips, even the bizarre coincidences. All of it began to make sense when viewed through the lens of deliberate misdirection. It was like standing back from a painting that had always seemed abstract. Up close, it was just brushstrokes and confusion. But now, with distance and perspective, an image was forming. And it was far darker than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 23. Closing in. With the puzzle nearly complete, investigators felt a shift. The case was no longer a blur of confusion. It was a hunt, and they were finally on the trail of their target. Every move was calculated, every step measured, because they knew whoever was behind this had proven capable of manipulation on a grand scale. Surveillance was increased. Phones were tapped. Old contacts were re-interviewed under sharper scrutiny. Even the suspect's smallest actions were logged, studied, and compared against the timeline. The pressure was mounting, and investigators could sense the cracks beginning to show. For the first time, the balance of control was tipping. The suspect, once hidden in shadows, was being pulled into the light. And while investigators couldn't yet prove everything in court, they were closing in fast. Faster than the suspect likely realized. Chapter 24. The final puzzle piece. After months of chasing shadows, the investigation came down to a single detail. The kind of overlooked fragment that, once discovered, ties everything together. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, but it was irrefutable. The final piece emerged from a re-examination of archived data. A timestamp here, a financial transaction there. Threads that had seemed unconnected until someone noticed the alignment. When cross-checked against the suspect's movements, the match was undeniable. That detail transformed theory into certainty. It confirmed what detectives had suspected, eliminated lingering doubts, and solidified the case. More importantly, it exposed not just how the disappearance happened, but why. Motive, method, and opportunity. 3 pillars that finally stood together in the same place. Chapter 25. The unsettling truth. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't the satisfying resolution many had hoped for. It was stranger, darker, and more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The disappearance wasn't the result of random misfortune or a simple crime. It was the outcome of years of hidden tensions, buried secrets, and a mind skilled in deception. For investigators, the revelation was a mix of triumph and dread. Yes, they had unraveled the mystery, but the story it told left a lingering unease. This wasn't just about one missing person. It was about manipulation on a scale that touched an entire community, bending perception until no one knew what to believe. And for the town, the truth cut deep. It exposed fractures in relationships, revealed betrayals long concealed, and forced everyone to confront the reality that the danger they feared had been among them all along.